Tractate Sheviis, General Introduction. In Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 and 11, it says, "For 6 years you may sow your land and gather in its crop, but in the 7th year you shall leave it untended and abandoned. And the poor of your people shall eat, and the beasts of your field shall eat what is left. So shall you do to your vineyard and your olive grove." In Leviticus chapter 25, verses 2 through 7, it says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come to the land that I am giving you, the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for Hashem. For 6 years you may sow your field, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and you may gather in its crop. But the 7th year shall be a complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for Hashem. Your field you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. That which grows by itself of your harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you have set aside for yourself you shall not pick. It shall be a year of rest for the land. The uncultivated produce of the land shall be yours to eat, for you, for your servant, and for your maidservant, and for your laborer and your resident who dwell with you, and for your animals and for your beasts that are in your land shall all its crop be to eat." And in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 2 and verse 9, it says, "At the end of every 7 years you shall make a cancellation, and this is the manner of the cancellation. Every creditor shall release his authority over what he has lent his fellow. He shall not press his fellow or his brother, for he has proclaimed a cancellation for Hashem. Beware, lest there be a lawless thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year is approaching, the year of cancellation, and you are stingy towards your needy brother, and you do not give to him. Then he may appeal to Hashem, and will be a sin upon you." In these passages, the Torah commands that every 7th year we are to leave our crops unharvested and allow others to take and eat them. We are forbidden to do certain forms of agricultural work, and we must forego loans that are owed us. This year is called Sheviis, literally 7th, or Shemitah, literally release, cancellation, which refers to releasing control of crops and debts. The laws involving the land and its produce apply only in Eretz Yisrael, like most of the Torah's agricultural laws, but the laws regarding loans apply outside Eretz Yisrael as well. Biblically forbidden work. The Torah names 4 activities that it forbids during Shemitah: sowing, pruning, which is cutting off dried branches so that the tree grows better, reaping, and picking. There is a difference between sowing and pruning on the one hand and reaping and picking on the other. Sowing and pruning are completely forbidden, while reaping and picking are forbidden only in a limited sense. Since the Torah permits the produce of Shemitah for eating, and since eating the produce would be impossible if all reaping and picking were forbidden, it is clear that the prohibitions against reaping and picking are not absolute. The Torah's intent is only to forbid reaping and picking in the normal way. One is allowed to reap and pick in a manner that is unusual. According to Rambam, the restriction against reaping and picking is in the usual manner applies to all produce of Shemitah. Other Rishonim, though, hold that it applies only to produce that grew in a field that the owner unlawfully closed off to prevent people from entering. The Torah obligates the owner to give up ownership of his crop and open his field to everyone so that they can enter and take what is growing there. If he broke this law and closed off his field, the produce must be picked in a way that is unusual. Crops from open fields, however, may be reaped or picked in the normal manner. Even when reaping or picking in a way that is permitted, one may not take so much produce that it will have to be stored for a long time. The Torah allows Shemitah produce for eating, not for long-term storage. Although the Torah's main passages about Shemitah do not mention plowing, this activity is also prohibited. According to the Tana, Rabbi Akiva, the phrase, "from plowing and from reaping you shall desist," forbids plowing even 30 days before Shemitah, and therefore plowing is certainly prohibited during Shemitah itself. The Tana, Rabbi Yishmael, however, understands this phrase as referring to Shabbos. In his view, the Shemitah-related prohibitions against plowing are learned not from a biblical verse, but from the oral law taught to Moshe at Sinai, which carries the same force as biblical law. Rabbinically forbidden work. In addition to the forms of work mentioned above, the rabbis forbade many other agricultural procedures during Shemitah, for example, clearing stones from a field, watering plants. As a rule, these rabbinic prohibitions apply only when the purpose of the activity is to improve the plants or the land. If the purpose of the work is merely to protect against harm, so that it just maintains growth but does not improve it, it is permitted. Pre-Shemitah prohibitions. Although Shemitah does not begin until Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, there is a prohibition to plow even before Rosh Hashanah. According to biblical law, this extra period, which is called addition to Sheviis, is the last 30 days of the 6th year. The rabbis extended the period to the time in the 6th year when plowing no longer benefits the 6th year's crop and is therefore obviously done in preparation for the 7th year. For ordinary fields, this time was set at Pesach of the 6th year, and for fields of trees, it was set at Shavuos of the 6th year. Many Rishonim hold that other forms of work besides plowing are also forbidden 30 days before Shemitah. Abandoning the Shemitah crop. The Torah commands the owner of land in which Shemitah produce is growing to give up ownership of the produce and let anyone enter his land to take it. This is learned from the verse, "But in the 7th you shall leave it unattended and unharvested." If a person blocks access to his field by locking the gate, for example, he has violated this commandment. However, once he has opened his field to all, the owner too is allowed to take produce for himself. As mentioned above, no one may take more than what he needs in the short term. It is forbidden to take so much that it will have to be put into long-term storage. Uses of Shemitah produce. The produce of Shemitah is sacred in the sense that it is subject to certain restrictions. These restrictions are learned from the verse in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 6, "The uncultivated produce of the land shall be yours to eat." This implies that Shemitah produce may be used only for eating, and it may not be wasted or used for business activity. For example, one may not buy the produce at a lower price to sell it at a higher price. It is derived from the word "for you," that Shemitah produce may also be used for any human benefit that resembles eating. When one eats, the food is destroyed at the same time that it gives benefit. Thus, any process of this nature is also permitted, provided that it is a normal use of such produce. For example, Shemitah oil may be used as fuel in a lamp, because the oil is consumed at the same time that it provides light. Shemitah produce, that is animal food, may be fed to animals, as stated in the next verse, Leviticus chapter 27, verse 7, "And for your animals and for your beasts that are in your land shall all its crop be to eat." Definition of Shemitah produce. Produce that is used for eating or any purpose similar to eating, such as fueling a lamp, has the status of Shemitah produce, which is subject to the regulations of Shemitah sanctity. There is a difference between various types of plants in regard to how they become classified as Shemitah produce. The status of fruit depends on when it first emerges from the tree. This stage is known as chanata, when the petals of the flower fall off, as stated in Rashi to Numbers chapter 17, verse 23. If a fruit reaches this stage in the 7th year, it is Shemitah produce. Otherwise, it is not Shemitah produce. The status of grain, such as wheat or barley, depends on when it reaches a third of its growth. The status of vegetables depends on when they are picked. The rabbinic prohibition of aftergrowths. Under Torah law, all Shemitah produce is permitted for eating and similar activities. However, the rabbis prohibited aftergrowths, i.e. plants that grew by themselves during Shemitah, either from seeds that fell from the crop of the 6th year or from roots that remained in the ground after the harvest of the 6th year. The rabbis were concerned that people might unlawfully plant crops on Shemitah and then claim that wheat grew, which is subject to the restrictions of Shemitah produce. Is the aftergrowth of the 6 year's crop, whose use is not restricted. To prevent this, the rabbis decreed that aftergrowths are forbidden. However, the prohibition does not apply to a fruit tree. Since a tree does not produce fruit in the year that it is planted, a tree illegally planted during Shemitah would not yield Shemitah produce in any event. The prohibition is limited to species such as grains and vegetables, which produce a yield in the year they are planted. The prohibition also does not apply to species that are not usually cultivated. Biur. Another law that applies to Shemitah produce is the obligation of biur, removal. This obligation concerns Shemitah produce that a person has picked and taken into his home. The Torah states in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 7, "And for your animals and for your beasts that are in your land shall all its produce be to eat." By mentioning both the animals, i.e. the domestic animals, and the beasts, i.e. wild animals, the verse teaches that a person may feed Shemitah produce to his domestic animals only as long as that type of produce is available in the fields for wild animals to eat. When the species is no longer available in the fields, for example because it is rotted, it has to be removed from the house. The person who picked produce of that species must perform the process of biur, in which he gives up his rights of ownership in the produce and puts it outside his house for anyone to take. Once this is done, the produce may be eaten. Even the person who had just made it ownerless could take it back for himself. If a person fails to perform biur at the required time, the produce becomes prohibited forever. Cancellation of loans. The Torah commands a lender to cancel all loans that have become due before the end of the Shemitah year, once Shemitah ends. At that time, he must give up his claim to money that is owed him, and he is forbidden to demand it from the borrower. See Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 2. However, because of these laws, there is a concern that people might refrain from lending money for fear that they will be unable to recover it after Shemitah. The Torah therefore prohibits one to turn away a borrower for this reason. A device known as a prosbul was instituted by the Tana Hillel, which allows loans to be collected without violating the Shemitah laws. The law regarding the cancellation of loans on Shemitah are not limited to Eretz Yisrael, but apply everywhere.